The Elves and the Shoemaker. Once upon a time, there was a painter. He was a good painter, and he made a modest living for himself and his wife. All was well except for one thing. The painter didn't want to be a painter. He wanted to be a shoemaker. "I'm drudging my way through life," he whined to his wife one morning. "Every day, 9 to 5. It's a canvas, a landscape, an easel, and oh, it's so dull. I want to do something creative." "But I always thought painting was creative," said his wife. "You deal with light and shade and perspective and such. You call that creative?" The painter shook his head sadly. "I'll tell you creative. Making shoes, that's creative. Something for the feet, something that lives, something to last through eternity. Shoes that sing." But just then the clock struck 9. Time for work. The painter shuffled off to the nearest still life, and with a sigh began dabbling and swirling the canvas. "I wish I were a shoemaker. I wish I were a shoemaker." Whew! The third time he said the magic phrase, an elf appeared, the patron elf of shoemakers. "So you want to be like Herman Cappuccino?" said the elf. "Who's Herman Cappuccino?" "No need to explain who I am," said the elf, pointing out he was already explaining in a previous paragraph. "But Herman Cappuccino, he was the greatest little shoemaker ever to live. When Napoleon tromped through Russia, whose shoes was he wearing? When Hannibal crossed the Alps? And when Dorothy, that girl from Iowa or something, clicked her heels, whose shoes did they have on? Herman Cappuccino, that's who." "Ooh," said the painter. "How could I be a famous shoemaker like Herman Cappuccino?" "It ain't easy," replied the elf. "You gotta suffer. You gotta spend time on the left bank of Paris. You gotta study. You gotta wear berets and develop poor hygiene habits." That night the painter told his wife of his plan. She shook her head. "Great shoemakers are not made," she said. "They're born. Why don't you forget about it and go back to something sensible, like your painting?" "No!" shouted the painter, stamping his feet and clenching his fists. "Anyone can paint. I want to sit in cafes, discuss shoelace expeditions, make loafers into garrettes, and above all, suffer." So that night the painter left for Paris. He entered the famous shoe school, Casseur, and under the tutelage of the famous and if unwashed professor Jean-Claude Louis Martel, he learned all that there was to know about shoemaking. He took the history of the heel in 18th century Brazil. He read all the books on tongue theory and the practice. He wrote an essay called "What Those Plastic Things on the End of the Shoelaces Are Really Called," but alas, he never learned how to make a shoe that sang. "If only I could make a shoe that sings of spring, of love, how can I make a shoe with a soul as well as a soul?" Just then, as he stood on Paris's main boulevard, pulling the rest of his hair out, he heard the most beautiful music. He followed the lovely sound, and there on his feet of a goatee-wearing man was a singing shoe. The shoe sang its song, then said, thank you very much. You've been a great audience. And it's for you, the audience, that I sing. Your appreciation is what..." "Now that's truly a shoe with a soul," interrupted the painter. "I must have that shoe." He reached down and started pulling it off. "What are you doing?" the man demanded. I just want to know where you bought your shoes." "I got them in Elvesville." "Elvesville? Why, that was the painter's hometown." He had been suffering around Europe when he could be home making shoes that sing. So the painter returned to Elvesville and found that everyone in town was wearing the same exquisite singing shoe. "Where did you get those exquisite singing shoes?" asked the passerbys. 2311 South Bunglong. You turn left about 3. "You don't have to tell me," exclaimed the painter. "That's my house." And sure enough, when the painter got home, he found the walls of his cottage lined with exquisite shoes, all of them singing merrily away. And who did he find sitting behind the cobbler's bench but his wife? "Why didn't you tell me you made exquisite singing shoes?" he asked. "You never asked me." And so from that day on, the painter went back to the easel every day from 9 to 5. Eventually, his paintings started selling like hotcakes, and he became a very famous painter indeed, and his paintings hung all over the famous museums in Europe. But he never became a shoemaker, and had to be content with just being a wealthy man, which just goes to prove not everybody can be Herman Cappuccino, or whatever that means. The end.